This Sunday's Gospel features an allegorized version of an original parable told by Jesus, now lost. It offers us an opportunity to appreciate the complexity and evolution of the Gospel tradition. Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 43. Jesus said to the chief priests and elders of the people, "Hear another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. Then he leased it to tenants and went on a journey. When vintage time drew near, he sent his slaves to the tenants to obtain his produce. But the tenants seized the servants, and one they beat, another they killed, and a third they stoned. Again he sent other slaves, more numerous than the first ones, but they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, thinking, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to one another, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and acquire his inheritance.' They seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. What will the owner of the vineyard do to those tenants when he comes?" They answered him, "He will put those wretched men to a wretched death, and lease his vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the proper times." Jesus said to them, "Did you never read in the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. By the Lord this has been done, and it is wonderful in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that will produce its fruit." The earliest New Testament version of this story is found in the Gospel called Mark, written around 70 Common Era. The document we call Matthew was written within 20 years following Mark's composition, and often Matthew follows Mark pretty closely. Neither version, the Matthean or the Markan, was told by the historical Jesus. The Matthean version of this parable we just read contains elements that are extremely difficult to attribute to the historical Jesus. For example, it features allusions to the Greek Bible. The historical Jesus, a Galilean peasant, never read the Septuagint. The Matthean version has allegorical features. The vineyard means Israel. The tenant farmers are Israel's leaders. The householder or landowner is God. But the historical Jesus told parables, never allegories. Folks, the version of this parable in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, Logion 65, offers fascinating possibilities for understanding the original version of this story that the historical Jesus likely told. In its present form, the Gospel of Thomas dates from the beginning of the 3rd century, long after Jesus, and was undoubtedly Gnostic. However, the Gnostic elements stick out like a sore thumb, and they are easily removable. What remains is a sayings gospel preserving sayings attributed to Jesus and collected 20 years prior to Mark's composition, just 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Logion 65, the earliest version of the parable of the tenants we know of, is an example of pre-Gnostic Gospel of Thomas Jesus tradition material that does not contain any allegorical elements and may be closer to the parable the historical Jesus originally spoke. In this simpler form, the parable reflects a reality familiar to all peasants everywhere, namely, the extortion practiced by hard-nosed absentee landowners. You see, originally, Jesus told a very simple parable, easy for Galilean peasants like himself to grasp. Galilean peasants made up the vast majority of his audience. And Jesus didn't go around telling cryptic stories about himself. He wasn't a megalomaniac or a narcissist, obsessed with himself. He didn't tell stories where every detail was allegorized to mean something that pointed to him. Instead, the historical Jesus told parables. And folks, parables are not allegories. They're different. In the original version of this story, the vineyard owner is not at all an allegory for the God of Israel, but was instead a usurer, a greedy son of a who lived in a different country. That kind of arrangement was common experience among peasants in Galilee. This wicked owner bribed the courts to foreclose on peasant ancestral lands they needed for subsistence farming. This man very likely stole the lands the tenant farmers in the story labor on. He rented the vineyard out to tenant farmers or sharecroppers, peasants who were probably the rightful owners. Then these poor people worked the land in return for a fee or a percentage of the crop. The owner sent his agents on a regular basis to collect what was due. Modern scholars have pieced together bits and pieces of information to gain a better understanding of the situation of tenant farmers based on what is known about first-century peasant freeholders in Herodian Palestine. That is, peasants who were fortunate enough to own and farm their own land. Some of the crop would have to be used for trade to gain other necessities in life. There were also social dues or gifts, religious tithes, and taxes adding up to about 35 or 40%. About 20% of the annual produce would be left to feed the family and livestock of a freeholding peasant. Far less would remain for starving tenant farmers who also owed land rent. Well, from this perspective, the parable becomes easy to interpret. The tenant farmers are frustrated, desperate peasants who are driven to violence. They savagely and understandably beat and murder the first two delegations from the owner. When the owner's son shows up, they miscalculate and presume that the owner is dead. Believing the son to be the sole surviving heir, they murder him in hope to gain the vineyard for themselves. The plan is stupid and illegal, but think about their plight. Think about how desperate they were, how they were driven to this act by the greedy elites. They were driven by their otherwise hopeless situation. Unfortunately for them, the greedy landowner is very much alive. Everyone knows what his response will be. He will avenge himself against those foolish tenant farmers, Godfather style, and lease to more compliant tenants. You see, the owner will not be deprived or defrauded of his harvest, a cash crop peasants cannot use for their subsistence farming, and that he stole through the kangaroo courts. If this was the form of the parable the historical Jesus actually told, then it was a warning to greedy urban elite landowners against stealing peasant lands and selfishly hoarding their harvest or exporting it. Of course, that is not really the version we get in either Mark or Matthew, who were literate scribes living far from the situation of the Galilee of Jesus. No, what we have in both Mark and Matthew is an allegorized parable. In general, a parable makes one point. The story was about a usurer, a greedy, evil ass, an absentee landlord and his poor tenant farmers. But by the time the story had reached the hands of Mark, it had been transformed into an allegory, where every element of the story meant something else. Jesus was a good storyteller, folks. And good storytellers don't explain their stories. Jesus was also funny, a master at insult humor. Good comedians don't explain their jokes. The point should be clear, and is clear, at least for people who are insiders to the context. Like the Joker says, if you have to explain a joke, then there is no joke. Rich elites just don't get the jokes of the poor and starving and exploited. And when the punchline lands, maybe the results are disastrous. See, when a story or parable gets interpreted, recontextualization is bound to happen to some degree. And this means that, inevitably, the meaning is not what appears on the surface. When a parable gets turned into an allegory, so many layers of meaning get added, and there is a real danger that the original version of the story gets lost entirely. In verse 43, the Matthean portrait, or recontextualized version of Jesus, really the Matthean Jesus Group preachers, or even the anonymous author we call Matthew, appears to make an allegory out of the parable, perhaps on the basis of Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Look carefully at the differences between this Matthean allegory and Isaiah. There are no tenant farmers in Isaiah. God destroyed the vineyard itself, whereas in Matthew, it's the tenant farmers who get destroyed. See the change? Unlike in Isaiah, the vineyard makes it out okay and is given to others. Now, in this gospel story from Matthew, the chief priests and Pharisees, verse 45, realize that the allegorized parable is directed squarely against them, and they're pissed. They would arrest Jesus were it not for Jesus' popularity with the crowds, who regard him to be a prophet. Clearly, in Matthew, which was written after the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era, the problem lies with the leadership of Israel, and not with Israel itself, as in Isaiah. The tenant farmers, that is, the leadership of Israel, must be replaced because they have not borne fruit. This is a theme seen throughout Matthew. Thus, the leadership of Israel will be transferred from the present group of Israelite leaders, which has failed, to a different group of Israelite leaders. Different group, preferable to the word people in verse 43. That group of Israelites will produce proper fruit. But who is this different Israelite group who will take over the vineyard Israel? Conveniently for Matthew, it is his own community, the Matthean Jesus group. At least he thought so back in the final decades of the first century. This simple parable raises probing questions about the responsibilities of land ownership and relationships between tenants and workers.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi. Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
Matthew's allegorized parable urges his contemporaries and modern-day Christians and Jews, and all people of different creeds and backgrounds, to reflect upon mutual relationships. Nowhere does this story support any idea that one people is superior to or will replace another. It gives no excuse for horrific anti-Semitic genocidal hatred the Christian tradition is stained by.